It was a crisp autumn morning, when my 10-year-old son, Micah, nervously adjusted his tie and smoothed out his blazer. It was his first day at his new school, and he was excited, but also anxious. I'd raised Micah to be confident and proud of who he was, but I knew that being one of the few black students in a prestigious private school could be challenging. "You'll do great," I told him, giving him a reassuring smile as we pulled up to the school gates. The imposing red brick building towered above us, its arched windows gleaming in the sunlight. Micah nodded, his dark brown eyes filled with determination. "I know, Mom. Thanks." As I watched him walk into the building, a part of me felt uneasy. I'd worked hard to give him opportunities like this, but I also knew not everyone would see him the way I did. Micah told me bits and pieces about his first few weeks at school. He liked most of his classmates and was quickly making friends. But there was one thing that bothered him: his teacher, Mr. Whitaker. "Mom, he's mean," Micah said one evening as we sat at the kitchen table. "Like, he always talks to me like I'm stupid." My heart sank. "What do you mean?" Micah frowned, pushing his mashed potatoes around on his plate. "He just picks on me a lot. If I answer a question wrong, he makes a big deal about it. And he's always telling me to sit up straight or stop fidgeting, even when I'm not doing anything." I clenched my fork tightly. Micah wasn't one to exaggerate, and I could tell this was bothering him. "Have you told anyone? The principal? Another teacher?" Micah shook his head. "I don't want to cause trouble." I sighed, debating whether to step in, but I decided to wait and see if things improved. One day, Micah came home unusually quiet. I asked him how school went, but he just shrugged and went to his room. Later, when I went to check on him, I found him sitting on his bed, staring at his homework. "What's wrong?" I asked gently. He hesitated before speaking. "Today in class, Mr. Whitaker asked me to solve a math problem on the board. I got it wrong, and he laughed. Like, really laughed. Then he said, 'Maybe math isn't your thing,' and the whole class laughed too." Tears welled up in my eyes. My son was brilliant, curious, hardworking, and capable. How dare someone make him feel small? "Micah," I said, kneeling beside him, "listen to me. You are smart. Don't let anyone, not even a teacher, make you think otherwise." He nodded, but I could see the doubt lingering in his eyes. I decided then and there that I wouldn't let this continue. The next week, I attended a parent-teacher meeting at the school. I dressed professionally, determined to make a good impression. When I entered the classroom, Mr. Whitaker was chatting with a group of parents. He was a tall, wiry man with graying hair and sharp, calculating eyes. When he saw me, his expression shifted slightly, but he quickly plastered on a polite smile. "Ah, Mrs. Carter, Micah's mother." "That's right," I said, extending my hand. He shook it briefly, his grip firm but cold. "Micah's adjusting well, I hope?" I asked, keeping my tone neutral. "He's doing fine," Mr. Whitaker said, his tone dismissive. "He's a bit behind compared to the other students, but I'm sure he'll catch up." I bristled but didn't let it show. "I'd like to discuss his progress in more detail sometime." "Of course," he said, with a thin smile, before turning to greet another parent. A few weeks later, the school hosted an open house event where parents could observe classes. I made sure to attend, sitting quietly in the back of Micah's classroom. At first, everything seemed normal. The students were working on a group project, and Micah looked happy, chatting with his friends. But then Mr. Whitaker called for everyone's attention. "All right, class," he said, his voice sharp. "Let's see how much you've learned. Micah, come up to the board." Micah froze, glancing nervously at his classmates. He slowly stood and walked to the front, gripping the marker tightly. Mr. Whitaker wrote a complex math problem on the board, far more advanced than what they'd been learning. "Go ahead," he said, stepping back and crossing his arms. I watched as Micah stared at the problem, his brow furrowed. He attempted an answer, but it wasn't correct. "Wrong," Mr. Whitaker said immediately. "Anyone else want to try?" The class murmured, and Micah's shoulders slumped as he returned to his seat. I felt a surge of anger, but kept quiet for the moment. Later that afternoon, during a Q&A session, I raised my hand. "Yes, Mrs. Carter?" Mr. Whitaker said, clearly surprised. "I'd like to share something with the class," I said, standing up. I walked to the front of the room, smiling at Micah as I passed. "Many of you might not know this," I began, "but Micah has a pretty amazing role model in his family." I turned to Mr. Whitaker. You see, his grandfather, Dr. Samuel Carter, was one of the first black mathematicians to work for NASA. He helped calculate the trajectories for the Apollo missions. The room fell silent. Even Mr. Whitaker looked stunned. And Micah's father is an engineer, I continued, and I happen to work in education policy. So, while Micah might be young, he comes from a family that values learning and hard work. He's more than capable of solving any problem you put in front of him, especially if he's treated with the respect he deserves. I turned to Micah, who was beaming with pride. You're going to do amazing things, sweetheart. Don't ever doubt that. The class burst into applause, and Mr. Whitaker looked thoroughly uncomfortable. From that day on, things changed. Mr. Whitaker was noticeably kinder to Micah, and his confidence began to grow. By the end of the year, he was excelling in math and every other subject. Micah taught me an important lesson that year. Standing up for what's right isn't always easy, but it's always worth it. And no one, no matter their title, has the right to dim someone else's light.